Hello, welcome back. Ready for the final session. It's been a long day, long marathon, but we have a very interesting last session on cities for sustainable food system. As it was mentioned in the session 2 in particular, where we presented the result of the OECD SDGs Committee of Regions survey, one of the 3 key areas that we identified as priority in this current crisis related to the war in Ukraine is the one on food, together with energy and the cost of living. So the idea of the last session is to go a bit more in depth and to do a deep dive into the food sector, and in particular to discuss the key role that cities can play to achieve a sustainable food system. We know that cities are crucial to achieve SDG 2, as the world is increasingly urbanizing. By 2050, an estimated 80% of all food will be consumed in cities, and therefore we are really looking forward to this discussion. The objective of this session are really to discuss the role of city for sustainable food system, and also the holistic nature of food system and the synergies that we can see that cities are already implementing between the food system and the broader localization strategy of the SDGs. The keynote speaker of this session, I'm really honored to introduce the Deputy Director General of FAO, Ms. Maria Elena Semedo. There is no need to introduce, to explain the key role that FAO is playing for SDG 2, for food system, for food security. More and more FAO is also becoming a key player in the discussion about cities and food system. So I'm really glad to give the floor to the Deputy Director General. Thank you again for accepting our invitation, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Stefanos, and good afternoon to all, distinguished guests, friends, participants. It's really my pleasure to virtually join the 6th Roundtable on cities and regions for the Sustainable Development Goals. I welcome the focus of this session on cities for sustainable food systems. And I would like to thank OECD for associating FAO to this discussion. As you said, FAO mandate is central to food, and now we are also working on cities and urbanization. Cities and regions are central to achieving sustainable food systems and SDGs, particularly, as it has been said, SDG 11 for obvious reasons. But as also has been said in the previous session, we are not on track and we need additional efforts. Urban dwellers consume up to 70% of all food, and this will only grow. By the end of this decade alone, 6 in 10 people will be living in cities, and all those people, they need to eat. Rapid urbanization is making it more difficult for urban population to access healthy diets in low and middle income countries. And why? This is due to increase in urban poverty, the inability of social services to accommodate urban population needs. And urban food systems are also key drivers of climate change and biodiversity loss. Cities are clearly driving and will drive the evolution of food system worldwide, for good or bad. It is up to us to make sure it is for good. And how? By shaping sustainable food systems. Today, I would like to flag to you some key areas in which we can cooperate to reform food systems based on FAO priorities, on FAO urban food agenda. First, let's promote multi-level food governance and the institutionalization of food strategies. How cities and local governments govern food systems and implement food strategies is critical part of the puzzle. We need to consider how food systems in cities are organized, both spatially and socially, and how we can shape better food environments. FAO supports cities to do so by establishing governance mechanisms such as food policy councils and food labs, by developing holistic food strategies and agri-food innovation, by providing guidance on integrated urban planning, and the planning is also an important part of this approach, and approaches that can create co-benefits and reduce the impact on urban areas. But cities cannot do it alone, and it has already been said. We need the national governments to look at how they can establish the appropriate enabling environment for cities. 2, manage food waste and composting systems better. We all know that food waste in urban areas contributes sustainably to greenhouse gas emission and biodiversity loss. So, reducing food waste at retail, food service at household level, and facilitating the consumption of unwanted food can provide many benefits for people and the planet, and to see how cities can reduce their contribution to greenhouse gas emission through the reducing of food waste. Just would like to share with you an example. In the municipality of Lima, Peru, FAO has helped to create a food liaison advisory group to tackle food loss and waste. One of the group initiatives was the city food waste task force that has established a composting center to managing biomass waste. As a result, the amount of organic waste disposed in landfills and city drainage has been cut. Third, promote urban and peri-urban agriculture, how we produce food to be eaten in the cities. By preserving agricultural land in urban areas, we can shorten supply chains and the amount of CO2 emitted when transporting food from rural to urban areas. Producing and selling more fresh food within a city can also increase opportunities for inclusive local supply chains and improve access to nutritious food, because it's not only to have food. The food needs to be nutritious or healthy, as you want to call it. For example, through farmers markets. In Medellin, Colombia, for example, FAO has been supporting the Department of Nariño, Antioquia, and Boyacá to build community gardens. More than 7,500 families have benefited from these gardens, allowing them to grow their own food and sell any surplus. 4, and I think is a very important one, educated the population on healthier choices and made these choices available and affordable. Education and public awareness schemes are important. We need to educate people about moving to healthy, diverse diets and avoiding food waste. But let's be honest, we are all living on cities. Diets are strongly influenced by the types of food available and their affordability. In cities where there is a large choice of fast food and convenience option, available food is often energy dense and highly processed. As a result, national government and city administration are dealing at the same time with undernutrition and obesity. So, education must go alongside measures to increase the availability and affordability of healthy diets, including by increasing access to market and food access points. I just came back from Chile, and when you go to the supermarket, you can find a labeling in the food telling you is high-level sugar, high-level salt, high-level on oil, and is it up to the consumer to make its own choice. Singapore Healthier Dining Program has shown that it is possible. Subsidies offered under the program increased availability and accessibility of healthy food and drink options tenfold since it began in 2014. Build stronger and more effective partnerships. FAO works with partners to support cities and local governments in many ways to ensure multiple benefits to urban dwellers and ensure cities are part of the solution. FAO does this, for example, by facilitating knowledge exchange between cities, including South-South and triangular cooperation. FAO Green Cities Initiative aimed at improving the livelihoods and well-being of urban and peri-urban population, targeting to have 1,000 cities by 2030. A Green Cities network will allow cities from all sizes, from megapolis to medium and small-sized cities, to share experience, best practices, success and lessons learned, as well as build city-to-city cooperation opportunities. So far, we have more than 100 cities, and we hope we'll be able to achieve by 2030 the 1,000 cities, and how we can have a better, healthier life on cities. During the United Nations Food System Summit, FAO and partners established the Urban Food System Coalition. This coalition is a platform where all governments and relevant stakeholders can take action for sustainable urban food systems transformation. And it has been also mentioned that it cannot be incremental. We need really to transform the way we produce and the way we consume. FAO is also ready to strengthen its partnership with UN Habitat, OECD, ICLEI, the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, and many other partners, with an eye on promoting cities and sustainable food system. At the Food System Stock-Taking Moment, it was referred the Food System Summit, we have end of July, the Stock-Taking Moment, and also in the lead up to COP28. Friends, colleagues, there is a lot to be done, and we'll continue to support member states and local authorities. FAO Strategic Framework 2022-31 includes urban food system as a priority area. Urban food agenda is an integral part of the organization's vision of resilience, integrated, sustainable, and inclusive food system, which ensure that all people in all places are free from hunger. And I'm pleased to announce that the 23 edition of FAO flagship State of Food, Security and Nutrition in the World will be focused on urbanization. And I hope we'll be having information, as it has been mentioned, the need to have data that will help us to build on indicators. And it will be launched by June during the ECOSOC meeting. This report will give us all food for thought on how urbanization is impacting the availability and affordability of healthy diets, and in turn, food security and nutrition. Colleagues, humankind is increasingly becoming an urban species. Yes, the urbanization has created major problems for food systems. But we must also remember that urbanization creates a concentration and confluence of ideas, energy, and collaboration. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted many fragilities in urban food systems. We all remember the difficulties in sourcing food as the global supply chain staggered, and we are facing the same now with the conflict Russia-Ukraine. But cities also show remarkable creativity, resilience, and solidarity during the pandemic, thanks to the people that made them function day by day. It is upon these qualities that you must draw so that cities can help to create sustainable food system. System that provide plentiful and nutritious food for all, slow climate change, and protect the nature and biodiversity that sustain us all. Thank you again for listening to me, and I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary General, for this enlightening keynote speech. So many key points that you touch in your presentation, from the importance of city-to-city partnership that was a focus of our discussion this morning, the importance of education, the importance of managing food waste and composting, that is a key area of work also at the OECD, also at the city level, with a big program on circular economy on cities. So I think this presentation really gives us the opportunity now to start our panel. Thank you so much again, Deputy Secretary General. And going to the panel, we have another level panel with first Gabriel Ferrero, who is the chairperson of the Committee on World Food Security. And Gabriel Ferrero couldn't be with us today, so he provided a video message that I'm asking my colleagues to share.
Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me immense pleasure as the chairperson of the United Nations Committee on World Food Security to speak at this roundtable on cities and regions for the Sustainable Development Goals. And I am very grateful to OECD for this kind invitation. Colleagues, indeed, this event is convened at a critical time for people, cities, territories, and the planet. We are witnessing rapid growing urbanization that, combined with the reorientation of urban and peri-urban agricultural lands to more profitable uses, have been gradually leading to a geographical decoupling of urban areas from sources of food supply. These trends pose high risks for food security and nutrition. It is increasingly recognized that in order to respond to these challenges, more integrated territorial development and balanced rural-urban linkages must be pursued for the benefit of both urban and rural populations. Sectorial policies will not be sufficient to eradicate poverty and hunger. Policy measures and incentives will need to be assessed from a food systems-wide approach and to take into account constraints determined by the interplay between geographic, social, economic, cultural, and institutional factors. While the conceptual shift towards enhanced urban-rural connections is visible in the global policy environment, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and very especially SDG 11, in the new Urban Agenda, the Decade of Action on Nutrition, at the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, at the local 2030 Agenda coalition from the United Secretary General, there is a need to translate these concepts into concrete policies and programs at the national, local, and territorial levels in order to improve rural-urban relationships and to ensure the participation of those most affected by food security and nutrition issues, and in particular, marginalized groups and smallholder producers. Colleagues, the UN Committee on Food Security stands ready to give its contribution through its evidence-based policy guidance tools. For those of you who do not know yet, the Committee on World Food Security serves as the global food governance intergovernmental body of the United Nations, where 137 member states, including most of your countries, are joined by civil society, by the private sector, by research and academia, UN agencies and programs, international financial institutions, foundations, and others, to deliberate upon and drive convergence on global policies to address systemic and structural causes of hunger and malnutrition in support of the efforts led by countries. Importantly, at its 50th plenary session celebrated last year, the committee decided to mandate its specific scientific body, the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, to prepare a report on strengthening urban and peri-urban food systems to achieve food security and nutrition in the context of urbanization and rural transformation. This report will be published in the summer of 2024, and it will inform the preparation of policy recommendations that will be developed and agreed upon at the Committee on World Food Security by all countries the following year. The objective of this process is to develop a set of focused, ambitious, and action-oriented policy recommendations that will encourage coordinated policies for food security and nutrition across rural, urban, and peri-urban areas within territories, taking into account the specific needs of the diverse rural and urban contexts. So I expect that these policy recommendations will play a very important role in informing interventions that contribute to more sustainable, equitable, and resilient food systems, urban and rural, as well as to changes in urban and rural planning to better support all dimensions of food security. It will be, hopefully, they will be a relevant tool in the hands of policymakers in their efforts to deconstruct the rural-urban dichotomy and reframe the policy environment around a more holistic approach to integrated policies. Cities, from small to larger cities, intermediate cities, local authorities, and stakeholders represent a very important target and potential user of the global policy guidance developed by the Committee on World Food Security, and I highlight the importance of further involving them in our activities through the implementation of inclusive, transparent, participatory processes. And this is why not just the OECD, but also the United Cities and local governments and the Milan Pact are part of the deliberations of the Committee on World Food Security on a regular basis. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, it is indeed time to work together urgently to transform our food systems to deliver food security, adequate nutrition, healthy diets for all people, while providing decent jobs and incomes, a renaissance of rural territories, recognizing the role of local governments and territorial institutions in food systems, planning and management, and the importance of strengthening their capacities and opportunities to engage in policy spaces. I thank you very much indeed, and I wish you a very fruitful seminar.
We are going to have, after Gabriel Ferrero, the Deputy Mayor of Milano, Anna Scavuzzo, that will provide a city perspective from the city that actually started the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact in 2015 during the Expo Milan. Then we are going to have ICLE, that will provide the perspective of a group of cities working on sustainable food system. And finally, we are going to have to keep this multi-level governance perspective, a presentation by my colleague Cohen Dekonik from the Agro-Food Trade and Market Division of the OECD, that will explain the OECD approach to food system. So I would now move to the Deputy Mayor of Milan, Anna Scavuzzo. Thank you again for joining the session. We had a similar session during the COP26, and you explained very concretely what the City of Milan is doing on sustainable food systems. So we'll now give the floor to you to really provide a more, let's say, bottom-up perspective on the role of City for a Sustainable Food System, explaining how what Milano is doing with some concrete action for a sustainable food system. Deputy Mayor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored and delighted to join today this important event. I would like to share the experience of my city, Milan, but also of the city of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact network, because it's very important, this approach, not just city by city, but sharing knowledge and in some way challenges together. I am the Vice Mayor of Milan, as you said, the Deputy Mayor for Education, and I am also in charge of the food policy of the city since 2017. First of all, I think it's very important to underline what Mrs. Samedo said. Cities are where the majority of the world population lives and eats, so challenges are enormous as well as opportunities. And I think that we can't but work together. And food systems are key drivers of urban and regional development. And I think that it's very important also a positive approach that we share. Cities and local authorities feel that there's a great scope in strengthening food systems at national and international level by building on the experiences of cities. This is what we are doing in Milan during and after the exposition with our food policy and with the Milanova Food Policy Pact network. Indeed, the City Council of Milan approved our food policy in 2015, and our main priorities, for example, are ensuring access to healthy food and water for all, fostering sustainable food production, promote food education, fight against food waste and food loss, and last but not least, promoting research in local food systems. And so define our food policy means implementing at local level SDGs number 16, strong institutions, and 17 on partnership. And in order to reach these ambition goals, we are working on what we consider as the main drivers of food system transformation. For instance, our school canteens. Through school canteens, we work to ensure healthy food for all children, as well as we can educate families towards a more sustainable and healthy diet. And this is, for instance, our way to contributing to SDGs number 2, zero hunger. Milano Ristorazione is our municipal agency for school canteens. Just to have an idea of how many meals they manage, Milano Ristorazione provides over 85,000 fresh and nutritious meals per day to our pupils. So among others, we have Milano Ristorazione and the municipality together with schools. And so we have another successful program. We call it Middle Morning Fruits, aimed at increasing fruit consumptions in classrooms. We provide fruit for the school break instead of snacks brought from home. And together with this program, we have another very important program for food waste reduction, encouraging kids to bring home bread and fruits that aren't consumed at school with doggy bags, provided by the municipal food agency. So different aspects, a very pragmatical way and approach, sharing together with the different stakeholders, focusing attention on pupils, on teacher and schoolmates, and on families with different actions, but promoted together. Through public food procurement, we are also working to promote short food chains to supply our school canteens with locally sourced food, such as, for instance, rice, that is 100% procured from the farms of the peri-urban area in Milan. And so you have food waste reduction, you have an impulse to peri-urban good agriculture, and you focus attention also on nutrition meals, as Maria Elena Samedo said more than once. Very important, this approach on healthy diets, because we have to change habits, not just to focus attention on some projects, but to change habits since the beginning, from children to family. Another example of actions taken under our food policy in order to reduce food waste is the creation of the Zero Food Waste Hubs, with the aim to achieve the SDG standard 12.3, halve the food waste by 2030. The city is coordinating a strong network of actors to collect food that still fits for consumption and is redistributed to the most vulnerable, thanks to a logistic model monitored by Politecnico of Milano. This is another example on how a city can lead a wide array of actors on enrich this SDGs number 17 on partnership. And so far, we launched at the beginning 2 hubs in the city. Then in 2021, we won the Herschel Prize, giving us the opportunity to carry on scaling up this action to other cities, but also in Milan. Now we have 5 hubs in the city, and we are going to promote this way of acting also together with our city and with the strong cooperation also with other stakeholders. And Soon we are going to host in Milan on this topic 10 European and US cities that will study our approach to implement their local food waste hubs, because each context, each city has its own model. We share ideas, we share good practices, and then each city can shape the way in which they can face these challenges. So thinking about this approach, I think it's very important to underline the force, the energy that we have in this Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, that is a city-led network on sustainable urban food system made by a city, Milan, that spread this idea, but with a strong network that counts over 260 mayors worldwide. I think it's very important also because in the relationship with different level and different governments, we have a bottom-up approach, but a sharing approach. So you can, in some way, count on a network of different experiences and different cities all over the world. And I think it's very important also for us supporting their collective work, because looking at cities, providing them with the knowledge and funding opportunities, we can support food system as a huge potential. And just to conclude, I would like to once again underline that cities are living laboratories of local solutions to global challenges, and they are key actors to localize and reach sustainable development goals. This is even more applicable in time of crisis, for instance, in the past pandemic, and also nowadays during this very difficult period, because each time you have that food is always among the sectors most affected. It's very important to have an approach that includes the local perspective, and because this local perspective that can be in some way very important key for a response that allows also resilience in communities and solid planning. So just to thank you for the attention to have for me and for us, I would like to carry on this relationship between cities that have a lot to share, and I'm very glad to see that this approach can be useful also for very important organization as yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vice Mayor, for also confirming some of the, stressing again some of the points mentioned by the FAO Deputy Director General on the importance of zero food waste, on education, on public food procurement, and on partnership, and this call for continuing this relationship and this collaboration that we will definitely do. Now I will move to the next speaker, that is Peter De Franceschi. He is a Global City Food Program Coordinator at ICLEI. So Peter, also from you, it would be great if you provide ICLEI perspective on the role of city for sustainable food system. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. And thank you for having us from ICLEI. ICLEI is a European and globally operating network of local and regional governments committed to integrated urban sustainability. When we open our mouth to eat, we enter politics. And I can hardly imagine anything that connects so much like food with all the SDGs. But when we talk about urban food, and we ask people what comes to your mind, many people think urban food is about a few passionate citizens trying to grow tomatoes somewhere in the city, and that's where it finishes. And still many policymakers don't know what the cities actually do when it comes to urban food policies and integrated food policies. And indeed I was glad to hear from Madame Semedo from FAO about the Urban Food System Coalition, because we have been working together with the FAO and GAIN in the Secretariat to run it and expand it. And what are the competencies of city? Well, cities, and Anna Scavuzzo eloquently put it, very much purchase a lot of food in schools, kindergartens, elderly homes, hospitals. They take care of the food waste. They take care of the logistics of food, of fresh food markets, but also the whole social food policies. So it's really a lot that comes. And there's food production. Indeed, I was surprised that in the survey, food procurement came not up at the top, because also in Milan, the main pillar of on their food policy is indeed the food procurement, which is amazing. Now, when you ask me about some good practices and policies of city, I think one is definitely the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. It's a good example how important it is that cities globally interchange and best practices get awarded. From ICLE, we have City Food, which is a global program on resilient, integrated, urban-rural food systems. It was launched even 2 years before the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact by 30 cities, and it applies a triple H approach: healthy people, healthy landscape, and healthy climate. And together with our cities, we move with technical expertise, accompany the cities on this progress. And together, as an example, just because we had also Milan, we work with the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, for instance, in a big project called Afri-Food Links. So we work with cities in Africa on integrated food policies, and we focus on 3 points. On one hand, we focus on governance. You mentioned, Stefano, the multi-level governance. It's important that the national, the regional, and the local level work together, because another important part is food environments. But you tell me what a mayor in a city can do in order to make it easier for citizens to make a healthy food choice. He cannot impact on the price to make it cheaper. Can he impact on the marketing, that the children go out of school and it's like sugar and salt everywhere? How much can a mayor do? And also, now with what's happening in the Ukraine and the higher food prices, there's little that a mayor can do. It needs this multi-level food governance. So in Africa, we work on multi-level food governance, but we also work on businesses. So we work on incubator and businesses, especially led by youth, by women, and see what is possible in the formal and informal economy. And finally, we focus on environments. But when you ask me the most concrete example of implementation of localization of SDGs, I usually tend to lift this plate. And my colleagues will say, oh no, he did it again. But for me, it's really this plate that symbolizes it all, because it's the public plate. It's the power of sustainable public procurement. Because if you do it well in one plate, for instance, in a school, you can link it with food education. Where does the food come from? And the food tradition. You can link it to climate if you reduce food waste, if you do the protein transition. You can link it to water. We heard it in the morning. No drinking water instead of plastic bottled water. We can link it to the soil, to the sustainable agriculture, to small-scale farmers. You can link it basically to all the SDGs. So it's a small plate, but with big impact. It's one plate, it's one health, and it demonstrates the power of public procurement. And also in this case, we from ICLE lead a project which is called School Food for Change. And again, one of the big partners is Milan. It's about impacting 3,000 children in 600,000 children in 3,000 schools. And it's all about food procurement. So there is a tender and the food lands on the plate, ideally linked to all these SDGs. It's about reaching out to the chefs, because you need to also talk to the ones that prepare the food. And it's also about food education. I believe that it's not just about feeding bellies, it's also about feeding communities, and it's about food education. And if that comes together, we can really change, because otherwise, with child obesity everywhere, and I'm from Italy, we are very proud about our food culture, but child obesity is really high in Italy. So if we don't invest in healthy, sustainable food plates, as I said, ideally linked to all the SDGs, there will be exploding health costs later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this very concrete example, for stressing the importance again of multi-level governance and this link with the Sustainable Development Goals. And maybe we will come back during the discussion to some of your points. In particular, I'm very interested to this project with Afri-Food, because we discussed a lot this morning about city-to-city partnerships, so we could see how this can be also a tool in the food sector. Now, last but not least, I'll go to my colleague Cohen De Konink, who is economist in the Agro-Food Trade and Market Division of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. So Cohen in particular works very much with the national government, so it could again reinforce this multi-level governance dimension and what national government can do to help cities in for a sustainable food system. Cohen, you have the floor. We cannot hear you, Cohen. Maybe you are muted.
Sorry, I'll try again. Thank you, Stefano. Thank you for that, and thank you to all the other presenters for the interesting examples and interesting discussions. My name is Koen de Koning. I'm an economist, as Stefano mentioned, in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD, and so I work mostly on agriculture and food systems issues, mostly talking to national governments. And about 2 years ago, we came out with a big report called Making Better Policies for Food Systems. And this was actually the first time that the OECD used the term food systems in a report. And it reflects this growing realization that there's a lot of issues that are connected to each other. As Mr. De Franceschi mentioned, it is all connected to food, all the SDGs. But unfortunately, at the national level and also at other levels, a lot of these issues have historically been dealt with in silos. The Ministry of Agriculture talks to the farmers. The Ministry of Public Health does something completely different. The Ministry of Environment is making regulations, etc. And there's more and more of a realization now that this cannot go on like that. We need to really work together. We need to talk to each other to come up with a coherent policy. And what this means is that we first also need to start thinking more broadly about what the objectives are. Because in the past, the Ministry of Agriculture was really focused with how much are the farmers earning, how much are they producing? And that was the objective they were looking at. And clearly this is not sufficient. And then you had the Ministry of Public Health, which was looking at the public health aspects, but was not really wondering about environmental sustainability. So the first step there is to get a broader view of the different objectives for food systems. And there are many, and indeed, they are linked to all of the SDGs. And so if you want to simplify it, you could call it a triple challenge. You want to achieve food security and nutrition for a growing population. You want to achieve livelihoods for everybody who is working in the food supply chain, not only the farmers, but everybody else along the supply chain as well. And also there is this enormous question of environmental sustainability, because food has an outsized impact on some of the world's most pressing environmental challenges. So food is responsible for an enormous amount of deforestation, land use change, biodiversity loss, water pollution, etc. And also, depending on the source of the calculation, between 1/4 and 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are somehow linked to food. So that is an enormous challenge. But how do you get this kind of coherent policy making? Because it's easy to say people should work together. Yes, of course, we know that. But then the real question is, what are the processes that you need if you want people to work together? And so we've done some work on that, and including working with the colleagues in Stefano's team on different kinds of policy processes to get more policy coherence there. And there's a few examples that countries have used that seem to work well. And at the national level, some countries have come up with a national food strategy that involves many different stakeholders. Some of this has happened in the context of the United Nations Food Systems Summit as well as food systems dialogues. And ideally, these should also involve the different levels of government, the cities. But this has historically been a little bit of a blind spot. And so it was wonderful to hear that FAO has a clear vision of how cities fit in with the broader agenda on food systems, because historically this was not really something that people thought of. When they spoke about agriculture and food, almost automatically it was the national government, almost automatically it was the Ministry of Agriculture that was in charge of it. So it is great to see that we're thinking a little bit more holistically about the different issues that we have and the different roles that people can play. And as Ms. Cavuzzo said, cities are local laboratories. I love this phrase. It's a fantastic way of thinking about it. We need to think about the relative strengths. We don't want cities to become a miniature national government trying to copy everything the national government is doing. We don't want national governments to try and do everything cities should be doing. It is a question there of what are the relative strengths, and also then how do you get people to work together? And clearly one strength of the city is that you're so close to the people, right? And one of the strengths of national governments or regional governments is that there's an advantage in scale and coordination. And if you think about an issue like food fortification programs, this is not something that a city government can manage all by themselves. This is ideally something that you have managed at a national level. And there's some other things like the examples we heard about food waste, etc., where really cities can probably play a much bigger role than they are today. One aspect I like a lot is this fact that you're close to the people. And there's a few interesting examples that we heard already today. There's another one that I wanted to share with you, which is that the city of New York is now going to roll out a program stimulating recycling of organic waste for composting. And in trying to stimulate people to recycle the organic waste, they chose not to focus that much on the environmental sustainability benefits, but to focus on the fact that it would reduce the number of rats in the streets. They understand what really motivates people. So this is something that only a city government would understand what really motivates the citizens, because you understand this kind of local culture. I also completely agree with the remark of Ms. Cavuzzo on the role of school meals. And I think actually one thing that we learned during COVID-19, which was a bit of a shock to many people, is actually how many children worldwide really depended on school meals for their food security. So this is something that now there is, in the context of the Food Systems Summit, School Meals Coalition, and it is definitely something that national governments should support. And as Mr. De Franceschi mentioned, indeed, public procurement is another important lever that cities have, and there are many cities that are working on green procurement. There are also things like the Cool Food Pledge that many cities, including Milan, have signed on to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the food that they procure. I do think here that national governments have a role to play as well. And it's something that we're currently indirectly looking at, because one complication for sustainable procurement is that sustainability is actually not that obvious. There are things that sound sustainable, but actually they aren't. And there may be other things that you would not think are a big deal in terms of environmental sustainability, and yet they are. To give an example, we know from the literature that livestock products tend to have a worse environmental impact than more plant-based alternatives. And within the livestock, on average, the ruminants, the cows, the sheep, tend to have a worse impact than the non-ruminants, like chicken or pigs. So this is not something that is obvious to everybody, and this is really something that even is very context-specific. Really, different producers might have different environmental impacts as well. So it's not something that is obvious for people to figure out what is the sustainable choice. It's of course something that larger city governments, they can probably hire the analysts or hire the consulting advice to help them with this, but not everybody can afford that. So there might be a role here for national governments to come up with a system for measuring and communicating what environmental impacts there are in food products. And this would greatly facilitate green public procurement for every local government, large or small. And it is something that we are currently looking at, actually. So this Tuesday, we will have our global forum on agriculture here in the OECD, and it will completely be dedicated to this question of how can we measure and communicate carbon footprints for food products. And then over time, we will also think about how do we add in other environmental impacts to get a full picture there. It is something, I think, where national governments can play an important role, also to coordinate with other national governments to come up with a harmonized system, which in turn would make it so much easier for cities to then implement these things at the city level. There's one final topic I wanted to quickly highlight, which is the role of resilience, which is not literally the same thing as sustainability, but I think it's very important nonetheless. When we look at things like the aggression against Ukraine, the role of COVID, the impact of COVID-19, this question of resilience is, of course, on everybody's minds. Historically, when people spoke about resilient food systems, they almost always meant only food security. Then almost always they basically only meant calories. And almost always they were basically talking about how do we produce more calories, more grains domestically. And this is really an extremely narrow focus if you think about it. And I think now we're coming to understand that, well, as I mentioned earlier, there's many more things we want from food systems. We also want environmental sustainability. We also care about the livelihood effects. So when we talk about resilient food systems, it's really also about more than just food security. That's one. Two is that we care also about a broader range of aspects within food security, not just the calories, but really healthy diets. That is what we are really interested in, including preventing childhood obesity, for example. And another aspect there is that we also know that there's many other things that shape food security or food insecurity. And actually, production, domestic production is not the main factor. The main factor is really poverty. And this is something that has become increasingly clear, that actually the main driver is often poverty. And so that means that targeted programs can often make a huge difference. And things like school meals programs, for example, can make an enormous difference. And so we need to think a little bit more flexibly about what is resilience for food systems. What are the types of tools we have to deal with resilience? And also, what are the type of risks we face? historically, people have mostly focused on things like bad weather leading to harvest failures. But during COVID-19, for example, one thing that happened was that suddenly all the restaurants were closed and people started buying food in shops. But people don't eat the same thing when they buy it to eat it at home as they would in restaurants. And restaurants, of course, also buy things in much larger quantities than what you would buy in the supermarket. So the entire food supply chain from one day to the next suddenly had to reorient all these different supplies, all these different products. So this is a kind of shock that we had never experienced before in peacetime. So there are many more things that can go wrong than we usually think about. But there are also many more tools we have to fix the problems once they occur or proactively. Now, one open question that we will be thinking about in the next year or so is, what are the processes? Again, what are the processes, the governance mechanisms to really build proper food systems resilience then? And I think it would have to involve something like a process where maybe 3-4 times a year we convene food system stakeholders at different levels of government, cities, national governments, different actors in the supply chain. We get together and we discuss specific scenarios, specific risks, and we ask, okay, if this were to happen, what would be the impacts and what could everybody contribute to fix the problem when it happens, or even now, how can we build resilience across the food supply chain, across the food system? So that's really an area, I think, where cities, because you're so close to the people, would have a crucial role to play. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cohen, for your remarks. We now have time for Q&A, at least 15-20 minutes. So I invite the people in the room to, as we did already before, to raise your flag if you have a question for the panelists, or I see that Mrs. Semedo is still online, or same for the participant online. Any question that you have, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will then ask to the panelists. I don't see any flag now. Maybe I will start with the first question to all the panelists, because as OECD, what we are trying to do is really to see how the framework of the SDGs can help to advance the food system. And maybe the question will be for both for the FAO Deputy Director General, if she wished to respond, how FAO is using the framework of the SDGs to advance the sustainable food system, and same for the Deputy Mayor of Milan, how the city is using the SDGs to advance this agenda. Maybe for Peter, you already mentioned this point. You could perhaps elaborate a bit more how city-to-city partnership can become a tool to advance the food agenda. And maybe also, Cohen, for you, the question on how the framework of the SDGs can help, in your view, advance the food agenda. So I don't know who wish to start.
I can start.
You have the floor, Deputy Director General. Thank you.
Okay, if I understand well, is how FAO is using the SDGs to move the urban food agenda?
Yes,
is this
exactly.
Correct?
Yes.
Yeah, because our agenda is based on the Sustainable Development Goals, how to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Our main goal is the SDG 2, but how to achieve the SDG 2 at the global level, but starting by the community level of the lower level. And this is how we work in interacting. And if you see in our strategic framework, all the indicators are based on the SDGs. And our strategic framework is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. These, you could see that the connection are there. We talk about SDG 1, SDG 1 on poverty, SDG 2, the sustainable cities, sustainable food production and consumption, the SDG 16, 14, just to mention some of them, to say that they are completely interlinked, but they are decentralized, I think, which is important, that we start at the lower level and then we go to the regional and the global level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Semedo. Mrs. Cavuzzo, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Yes, it's very interesting also to have this panel together FIO also because we have a deep relationship with FIO, and also in my reply to your question, I try to underline also the role that we have inside the network, because yes, the city of Milan, for the city of Milan is very important, the SDGs framework, to advance and implement our food policy. But I think that all the cities can share the same framework, so they can have different response, but they share the framework, the goals. And it's very useful also to have a sort of platform, a common platform, because this fact permits you to in some way fit and shape your food policy, but in a common family together with other cities. In 2017, the city of Milan, together with other 13 cities around the world, in cooperation and collaboration with FIO and RUAF, proposed and developed the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact monitoring framework, we called, a set of 44 indicators to evaluate the progress made by the city of the network in adopting the actions recommended by the pact. This work provided the opportunity to reflect on the potential contribution of Milan Urban Food Policy Pact cities to the SDGs. So we share the approach, we share the goal, but also we share a monitoring framework in some way to evaluate our cooperation and the results of our activities. And the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact indicators have been associated with the 5 priorities of Milan's food policies, for instance, talking about what happened here in Milan. They have been linked to the SDGs and related targets. And in this way, through the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact indicators, 11 SDGs and 25 targets have been identified. And so we can evaluate also the importance of our partnership and also of our policies. And in our administrative documents, as in other cities, but in Milan, we refer to the SDGs relevant to the specific text. And so in some way to shape not just a political approach, but also an administrative approach. So document for politics and politicians, but also pragmatical acting inside the institution. So I can say that SDGs are a guidance in our work as they help us to better frame our invention. And I think it's very useful for us also because, for instance, we are promoting in Italy an exchange between cities from our country to share this approach and this guideline. And I hope that in each country, the city of the network can do just the same, with the difference that each country asks to their cities and also the different legislation they have to respect.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. And now back to Peter. So if you can elaborate a bit more in particular on the role of city-to-city partnership to achieve a sustainable food system.
Yeah, maybe I can just pick out 2. Also seeing here FAO. So with FAO, we are leading on an interest group on sustainable food procurement. There's also, for instance, Copenhagen part of it, and something that we try to set up is really a network of food procurers, because what we've seen also in Europe at a more regional level, it's really good if there's peer-to-peer exchange in a safe space to talk about what doesn't work, what works, what did you do there, what, and replicating. And on the other hand, as I mentioned already, with GAIN, the Global Alliance of Improved Nutrition, and FAO, we are a part of this Urban Food System Coalition. There it's also advancing, but we still need to have national governments on board. I must say that with FAO, like with other UN nations bodies, it's big, it's institutionalized, and it takes some patience. Sometimes the city wants to go faster, but as they say in Africa, it takes quite a long time to get an elephant moving, but once it moves, it's unstoppable. So we'll be there tickling the elephant and working together with the cities to trying to implement urban food systems and roll it out, because as we know with the SDGs, we have 7 years left, and we cannot wait much longer.
Thank you, Peter. Finally, back to Cohen, if you can also provide your perspective on the role of SDGs, maybe more at the national level to advance the food agenda, and if in your work you are making this link.
Yeah, in our work, definitely. And as I mentioned earlier, the different objectives, it's very easy to map them to the SDGs. Food links to almost all of them. I think what the SDGs are really great for is that it does create a common vocabulary. And we all feel that there's many different objectives out there where it can be a bit confusing to talk about them if you don't have a clear vocabulary. And the SDGs are that vocabulary. It's almost like a checklist, because when people start developing a policy, you know, everybody has their own expertise and their own specialization, right? And if you start developing a policy, it's easy to forget certain aspects. And you could think of the SDGs almost like a checklist. Have you thought about this SDG? Have you thought about how your policy proposal would impact on these or these SDGs? And some governments, many governments already use a form of regulatory impact assessment, which is a kind of checklist. It doesn't necessarily cover all of the SDGs, but ideally it should. So it's an example of how you can use the SDGs to have a better quality control on policy proposals, to avoid negative trade-offs, and maybe to identify positive synergies between different policy proposals. So of course, there's still then a question of synergies and trade-offs, and how do we know how big those synergies or trade-offs are, and how do we deal with those? So it doesn't solve the problem magically, but at least it gets everything on the table, ideally. That being said, of course, we have to be honest, not every government is already at that point, but I think it is something to strive for, yes.
Thank you so much, Cohen. For the one online that are asking, we are still trying to fix the issue with the video. So far, we didn't find a solution. In any case, it will be made available with all the proceeding after the event, but maybe there is still some hope in the last 10 minutes. There is one question online that I would like to share with the panelists in particular. The question is it possible to think that poverty can be fought from the cooperation between local food security and the understanding of an environmental coordination between public governance, social governance, and corporate governance? I don't know, it's not an easy question, but I don't know if someone would like to try to address this. Peter? I see you knocking, I don't know.
Well, that's what we always try for. You know, I mentioned these two projects. For instance, School Food for Change. You can also look it up online, where we combine food procurement. So it's the public procurement, the public demand. But that is one example of multi-stakeholder involvement, because it's the private side that supplies, small-scale farmer. It's about supplying food in many countries and cities and schools also for free. So that's one. In AfriFood Links, it's more, we start more from the business side and try to bring together in vertical and horizontal way the different governments level and business. But for me, I remember like during the UN Food System Summit, we coordinated independent food dialogues in different cities in the world. And for me, the most, the one that impressed me most in order of stakeholders was really in the US. There were different cities, and it was all about equitable food systems. And it was really strong how to see how the different, they were much more thinking into terms of communities coming together, community leaders, minority leaders. And I remember, for instance, the food director from New Haven saying, our main problem is they don't see us. So there were so many different issues coming together also from a social side, but then again, it was interesting to see how these different stakeholders would work together and find ways, sometimes also public-private partnerships. But there are different ways, you know, how this can come together. But for me, systemic and integrated, it's always multi-stakeholder. Otherwise, it doesn't work and it's not sustainable.
Thank you so much, Peter. We have another question in the chat that I will again share with the panelists. Achieving SDG. Achieving the SDG 2 is closely linked to the SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. When we consider the need for composting, the food waste and the use of resulting fertilizer in the food production, is it an alternative solution to provide food security to teach the communities how to produce their own organic food? I don't know if anyone would like to address this question. Maybe Cohen.
Yeah, it's so it is true, of course, that all these challenges are linked to each other. But there's an issue here just with basic numbers. So globally, producing food occupies something like 50% of all of the available land in the world. By contrast, all the cities together are maybe 2% of all the land. So if you wanted to produce all of the food locally, and many more people are living in cities, if you wanted to try and do all of that at an urban scale, mathematically, it's impossible to do that. There is an interesting question there about how you close this kind of loop where we have food waste and also excrement, right? How do you close that loop again if you want to achieve a more circular system? There's an enormous logistical challenge there about how you do that. That is something that many people are looking at. That is an interesting question. So closing that loop is going to be an important part of sustainability at some point. I think we're not yet quite there in terms of figuring out how to do that, how to make that circular. I want to just warn a little bit about being too much fixated on the idea of organic production. So organic production is one possible tool of increasing the sustainability of food production. It's not the only tool, and it's not necessarily in all situations the best one. One of the drawbacks is that it achieves better environmental performance per unit of land, but it also achieves a lower yield. It produces less food per unit of land. And so when you look at the environmental impact per unit of products, it's not always better. And at the same time, it does require more land. And so, as I mentioned, we're already using something like half of the world's land for food production. So anything that means that we would need to use more land is problematic because it could indirectly put even more pressure on natural landscapes, on forests, and so on. So that's something why in the scientific community, people are not saying that we should only do that. It might be one part of the toolkit, but we should also think a bit more flexibly about achieving that sustainability.
Thank you, Cohen. I know that Peter wants to add something, and then I will have a question from the city of Bonn, and I think Ikle again.
Yeah, I just wanted to make this point that there's no health of people without the health of the soil, and I'm very glad that in Europe now we have a healthy soil mission, and when we talk about food waste, this should be all linked, because without a healthy soil, on dust, nothing grows. So I think this comes up now more stronger and stronger. When we talk about circularity, this is really a good development.
Thank you, Peter. Verena?
Yeah, thank you. It's a question to your colleague Cohen and maybe also to Peter, if he could highlight a bit more on the measurement of the effects of sustainable food systems. In Bonn, we do a lot, but what we see is that there is, if we talk about regionally, organically produced food, you deal a lot with small-scale producers in the region, which are not very well set up, for instance, to produce figures. And on the other hand side, we deal with large producers that are, of course, ready to do that. So I would like to know more about if there are some thoughts on the measurement already. And I know that EQA is doing something with the circular tool. I don't know, maybe you can tell a little bit about that as well.
Thank you, Verena. You want to start, Peter? And then Cohen.
Yeah, there are many tools. I mean, Milano mentioned the Cool Food Pledge of the World Research Institute that helps a lot to measure the protein transition, so having more plant-based food, more vegetable, pulses, legumes. On the other hand, there are very good initiatives about food waste reduction to measure it. I think that's easier. Bruges here is a very good example, also linked then to climate. When it comes to health, that's really difficult, and or to link it to CO2 emissions. You know, how to save the CO2 emissions, that's sometimes a bit more trickier, and it's also true that there are still not so many data to prove that if you have healthy food and combine it with food education, that leads to healthier children, for instance. But we do that in School Food for Change, and to assess that. But there was a recent study in the States that proved indeed that food, for instance, at school lead to a reduced body mass index. So there are links there, but I'm glad that also organizations like OECD takes it on, because you do a lot of also data management and data research. I think much more is needed to show the impact, because we need more of this evidence.
Thank you, Peter. I will now give the floor to Koen, and then I saw that the Vice Mayor was raising her hand if she wants to intervene. Okay, first Koen and then the Vice Mayor.
Indeed, it's an excellent question. I think actually you hit the exact issue with measuring environmental impacts for food. So as you probably know, in the European Union, for example, large factories already they fall under the European emissions trading scheme. So there's already a whole process for managing and measuring those emissions, etc. And there's less than 20,000 factories that are part of the scheme. But there are 9 million farms in the European Union. And this is only talking about the European Union. So globally, there are 600 million farms. And maybe unfortunately, we also know from the scientific evidence that one farm can differ a lot in terms of environmental performance compared to another farm, even in the same country. So it's misleading to just use a global average. Many people do. Many people would just use global averages. But we know it's not the right way to do it. If you use an average, you can also not really reward the producers who are making an effort to do something else. So ideally, we would be able to measure it for each individual farm, or each individual producer. The solution is, there is an intermediate solution, and it's based on calculation tools. So scientists in many countries have done detailed measurement for a few hundred farms, and then they looked at what determines the environmental performance in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen, etc. And they try to link it to numbers that are easier to calculate or easier to observe, like what kind of animal feed are they using, what kind of manure management practices is the farmer using, etc. So they build a statistical model around that. And then you can use that model, you can go to a farm and you can basically ask maybe 20 questions. And based on that, you can get a number for the environmental impact that is relatively precise, ideally, if the model works well, and doesn't require too much effort. So this is something that we're currently looking at, because this is the way, if we want to scale up this measurement, and we need to, this is probably the way to do it. We need to come up with really reliable tools that are easy to use, but that are still scientifically very rigorous, so that even the smaller local producer, we can just go there with a checklist, we can plug in the numbers, and we can get a reasonable estimate for what the environmental impact is of what this person is producing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Koen. And now Deputy Vice Mayor.
Thank you very much. I think that Peter and Koen had the chance to underline very important elements in reply to the question. I would like just to have another topic in this reasonment on evaluation based on healthy diets. How healthy are our diets? And how can measure the importance of introducing healthy diets in the habits of our children and of our population? This is another topic very important. We are at work also to, in some way, find out something similar to the tools of Schools for Play, and trying also to face, for instance, the challenge of obesity and of obesity in children, trying to find out a correlation between healthy diet habits, good habits, for instance, sport, introducing sport at school, and obesity and well-being in children. We are trying to work together with our sanitary system, and so administration, school system, and managing school canteen together with sanitary system to find out some data. Also to face these challenges, not just as an approach, an holistic approach, that you know that there is a correlation between healthy diet and health and well-being, but find out the way in some way that can evaluate the importance, also because a sustainable food system is also a food system that promotes well-being, also from healthy point of view. I think that also this aspect could be in our agenda in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Vice Mayor. We have another, yes, sorry, please.
Hello, so Angèle Tost from IGLE. I think we mentioned, so you mentioned in the Q&A the role of public institutions and of the private sector, but I'd like to come back to, I think, something you all mentioned in your interventions, which is how to embark citizens also through food education, but through other means as well. I think specifically on food and thinking about food waste, for example, the latest data at EU level shows that more than half of the food waste comes from the household level. So how can we really embark citizens and make sure that beyond actions from the public sector and the private sector, there is also some buy-in from the consumers? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question in the room, or you want to try with the video? Vice Mayor, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Very good question. For a city, it's very important to face these challenges and raise awareness in the whole population. So you start from children and school canteens, but you have to promote this approach also with families and all those involved in education. First of all, you have to deal with the issue. So you have also to communicate to family every project you are proposing to their children, because children can be very useful ambassador in family. Second point, you have to promote also in different topics and in different aspects of everyday life. So there should be a link between what happens inside school and what happens inside the city. For instance, in May, we promoted the Forum of Food Policy all over the city to engage the whole population, because we have to share the same goal, not just for children, for young people, for families as separated parts of the cities. And I think it's very important that in our communication, we stress the importance of an holistic approach of the entire community. And so each one can do his own, can play his own role. And it's very important also to raise awareness in others. You know that sustainability is one of the issues promoted by Fridays for Future, movements driven by young people. You have a very important engagement in the activism, but we have to driven some path to in some way collect all the actions, because we need that the entire community can share the same goal, can share the same challenges. And also the private sector can be a very useful partner in this. Also because from their point of view, they need also to, in some way, have a return of investment of their activity with the whole population. And so we have a public effort shared by private and public sector, but we have to focus attention on what is public: health, sustainability for environment, livable cities, and the possibility of sharing education, not just with children, but also with the young. For instance, we have a very important project with universities and with the private sector in city, starting from canteens for instance, enterprises and activities. So universities and enterprises, also because you have to, in some way, be aware that it's important for a child to eat in a proper way, but it's important also for you when you go to university, because you are a teacher or a student, and also when you are at work and have you short lunch. I think it's a sort of approach that you have to share with your community, and you have to share with your communication team. We have to, in some way, avoid the mistake to consider education just for pupils.
Thank you very much, Vice Mayor. Si Cohen would like to respond to this question. Cohen?
Yes, I think it's an interesting question. I'd like to even ask it a bit more broadly. What can we do to reduce food waste at the household level in general? And if you look into the scientific literature and the reports by international organizations, and you just search for food waste, you'll find thousands and thousands of reports talking about food waste. Then if you ask, okay, how much food waste is there? What are the numbers? Suddenly there's much less information available. And FAO and UNEP have collected the available information there. So there's a few hundred reports that they summarize in their reports. And if then you ask, okay, now what can we actually do? What do we know about what really works? What is the evidence on policies, public policies that really work? There is almost no evidence. I wouldn't say there's no evidence. There was one study a few years ago that identified 12 12 studies that had found something that seemed to work. But this is 12 studies for such an enormous global challenge. This is nothing. This is, if you compare it with how we do things in the medical fields, if we want to know whether a treatment really works or not, we are much more rigorous on assessing that. And it's not because there is a shortage of initiatives. There is actually a lot happening. But the problem is that a lot of the times when people do an initiative, they don't really think about it the way that a scientist would in terms of how can we now really evaluate whether this worked or not. For example, a lot of initiatives happen and they would not really do a baseline measurement or a baseline assessment of how much food waste there is before they took the initiative. So then, of course, it's very hard to see before and after whether you had an impact. Or they might not have a control group where you don't do the projects so that you can see whether the project actually made a difference or not. But these kinds of techniques are actually very important. And so, you know, as Ms. Cavuto said earlier, local governments, cities are local laboratories, right? But in an actual laboratory, people are quite rigorous about what they measure and how they measure it, etc. And I think we need to add that layer of measurement, that layer of rigor, because only then can we really get the learning. Otherwise, we're going to stay stuck in anecdotes and things that are, you know, imprecise numbers, and we may waste a lot of time and waste a lot of energy with things that actually don't really work, and we might miss the really impactful things that do work. So it's a plea to everybody to focus much more seriously on this question of measurement of whether it actually works or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cohen. There are many other interesting questions in the Q&A in the chat. Unfortunately, we are 5 minutes late, so I would close here the session. But first, I would like to thank again all the speakers, starting from Mrs. Semedo, the Deputy Director General of FAO, Gabriel Ferrero, the chairperson of the Committee on World Food Security. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to project the video, but we'll make it available after the event. The Deputy Mayor of the City of Milan, Anna Scavuzzo, Peter De Franceschi, the Global City Food Program Coordinator at ICLEI, and finally my colleague Cohen De Koning from the Trade and Agriculture Director of the OECD. Thank you very much again, and now I will give the floor to Aziza for the final remarks.
Thank you, Stefano. I have two good pieces of news. The first one is that this is the last intervention of a very long day. And the second one is that this is going to be a very short one because nobody wants to stand between you and the cocktail. So we're all trying to make sure to wrap up very quickly, but I wanted to give a few heads up as to what's coming next. First, a big word of thanks to all of you who've been here in the room. I think we had at some point 80 people at the beginning of the day, and then slowly, but we still have a core group of several dozen, so that's wonderful. And I think we were close to 200 online at some point, and we still have 100 on average online. So that's a proxy for resilience. It's been a fascinating day, and we've learned a lot from all of you. So thank you for your generosity, your time, and for sharing your wisdom with us. I think the way we've tried to build this agenda reflects somehow the way we conceive this roundtable as a mechanism not only to share stories that work, but also headaches or painful parts of the job that we have on a daily basis, where some of you indeed conveyed that we can be quite satisfactory in terms of raising the profile of local and regional governments, including within the UN Forum, but that there's still a long journey to travel to get there and to really not only open everybody's eyes on the huge potential that we have to unlock when it comes to the role of subnational governments, but also sometimes the huge distance that we have to travel, even in advanced economies, for many of these goals. And I think the insights that were provided on the current state of play of SDG 11, for example, and some of the sectors that were pointed out as being really areas where much progress is needed and expected, from transport to housing to even civic participation, and all these discussions around the trust crisis, the geography of discontent, the need to renew the social contract, I think speak not only to the global south, but also to many economies in the global north. So a lot of knowledge sharing today. I think we try to strike a balance between country-specific insights, and I think we were delighted to have Germany on the spotlight this time, with big thanks again to GIZ, to BMZ, and also to Engagement Global and all the stakeholders from the country that have opened the books for this first ever DDC review. If there are volunteers that are inspired by Germany and wish to come next, we're always keen to start that conversation. We also had this last deep dive on food as a thematic stream itself, which I think is always enlightening to see also how advancing a specific goal can have positive cascade effects on other goals, and the other way around, how procrastinating on specific goals generates a huge cost of inaction, if I can say so, for the SDG agenda overall. And I think the intersectoral and interconnectedness of SDG 2 with many of the other goals, as this was said today, also speaks to the holistic framework that the SDGs provide. A good spotlight on the global environment and the multi-crisis environment and how disruptive this can be whenever it comes to the longer-term stability of policy frameworks. A range of local stories. I pointed Helsinki, Braga, Bavaria, Bonn, Kitakyushu, the Basque Country, Milan and Warsaw, amongst others, but we had many city representatives in the room as well today, and many others that were undergoing significant work with, and a number of overarching frameworks or policy standards that were launched today from the Global Policy Toolkit that we hope will be inspiring for many of you going forward in your DDC approach, all the way through basics that we recall, the monitoring and evaluation framework and the checklist that we developed under this work. Now, what's coming next, and I think there are three main areas maybe where we'd like to draw your attention. The first one is, of course, the big moment that the high-level political forum will provide, combined with the SDG summit. So July, September will be very, very busy for all of you, but also for us, and in particular this massive effort that is ongoing to rejuvenate the data that we have produced at the OECD to track distance to end values of 600 plus cities and 600 plus regions on a range of indicators, over 130 indicators, if my recollection is correct. So there's a lot of data work ongoing to bring the numbers up to date and make sure that they're featuring also the latest developments that we know have affected SDGs progress, whether we're talking about the food or energy crisis and the post-pandemic succession of shocks, if I can say so, that have become a sort of new normal for many governments. That's the first point. Also want to flag that we have a number of case studies that are ongoing and that will be published over the coming month or year. Most advanced ones are with Bolzano in Italy, right? A pilot on localizing the SDG, and we're also continuing work with Paraná in Brazil and Cordoba in Argentina, and I know we had their representatives online with us today. Thank them also because the time difference didn't disrupt their participation from 9 a.m. this morning to literally 5 p.m. today, Europe time. So thank you all online. And then we're starting these days a new pilot with the Basque Country also, which is a fantastic piece of news and will provide additional insight and add to this compendium of already 10, I think, case studies, 11 case studies completed, I think, that go forward. I think the last point I wanted to flag, and I think it's more an invitation for us to continue to structure this conversation as part of this roundtable that we'll probably convene again in the coming month. We usually do twice a year. Maybe now it's once a year, once every 9 months. We see when Stefano has the absorption capacity, basically. Which is this multi-level governance dimension, and that's my last point. I think many of you were actually very vocal that we need to raise the profile of cities and regions, but they can't fix the magnitude of the challenge on their own, and this should by no means be a substitute for national level implication, and I think this was crystal clear also for the OECD as an intergovernmental organization working with national governments to hold national governments accountable for how they're engaging with their subnational governments and the other way around, and multilateral institutions as well, and they have to do their share. But there was also the other side of the coin saying that public public authorities can do things up to a certain point, and there's probably a need to have the private sector step up. I think this was a very strong point that was made by the Vice President of the Committee of the Region this morning, and industry, and in particular we see many SMEs, of course, being not so aware and lagging behind compared to big multinational large companies. And also in this afternoon's conversation, the role of citizens and the way we have also to mainstream or retrofit this global agenda in our daily consumption, production practices and so on. So this is this multi-level governance item, something that has been really the DNA of this roundtable, and we'll continue to work along these lines. Many thanks to all the OECD colleagues, but of course the team that is in the room today, Stefano, Aline, Lawrence, they have struggled a lot, but I think it was very smooth. So we can applaud them if you allow me, and also the team that is in Paris and still online, and I'm thinking of Josh and Mina that I see are also the oil in the machinery that made everything work, Lucy, Mana, and many other colleagues that have been instrumental up to today, and the colleagues from the other departments that you've heard, Marcos on data, Koen just now on food and agri, Rachel and Pilar this morning on development cooperation. This is also a means for us to connect the dots in-house and to lead by example with this horizontal collaboration. Many thanks to the European Commission colleagues and partners, to the Committee of the Regions for hosting us today. Really wonderful to the many UN agencies that have embarked on this journey with us, FAO, DESA, Habitat, we had them, the city networks that we had with us today, UCLG, ICLEI, CEMR, but also SDSN, Bettersman, and many others that we're shaping a new stream of work with these days. So thank you all. I hope you have a few takeaways. As I said, the good news is now we have a cocktail for those who are staying in Brussels a few extra minutes. I think it's in the atrium where we had lunch, right? Yeah. So the pathway to lunch, and we'll take a bit of a break all together. And it's not completely done for some of you, because tomorrow at 8:30, because this guy never gives you a break, the steering committee of this roundtable on cities and regions for the SDGs is meeting for a working day. So looking forward to seeing those of you who are part of the steering committee, and a safe trip back to the others. Many thanks to those who are online. And a final reminder that the recording will be uploaded in the coming days, and probably a summary of the roundtable as well. Thank you all.